going to adjust. Where are the microphones?
They're here.
Okay. Okay, so I should bring this over here. Well, thank you for that warm introduction, and it is indeed my honor. I'm used to having a mic on me. So if you can't hear me and I start roaming around, which I tend to do when I talk, just pull me back here. It is my honor and pleasure to be invited here to Trinity College for Trinity Week, an amazing set of events on the science of happiness. Thank you very much. So my talk is called Let Us Smile Each Chance We Get. And because we are talking about the science of happiness, I didn't put up just any smile, but a very famous smile. This is the French neurologist, Duchenne de Boulogne, who appended electrodes to people's faces, volunteers' faces, and by doing so, he wanted to map what he called the movements of the soul. And he was able to distinguish, perhaps for the first time, that there are in fact two very different kinds of smiles. One of them is what we call the social smile. We just pull up the corners of our lips and smile. Now that's a very easy motion for any of us to make. We can do it when we're just being polite. We've seen that smile. Thank you. We can sometimes use it actually to mask a bad feeling. You know, the dentist says, you know, you have 10 cavities. Oh. But the true smile of enjoyment involves the muscles around the eyes, what are called the orbicularis oculi. My first studies were in facial expression, and I always come back to this. So let us smile each chance we get, going back to Duchenne de Boulogne, and we'll see that many studies will use the sincere versus the fake smile in trying to gauge and assess happiness. Well, what exactly are we talking about? Okay, that's the title. So first up, I put here the World Happiness Map. And we see here, first of all, that the lovely green areas are the areas that are happiest in the world. And so I'm proud to say the United States is in there, as is Ireland. We are very fortunate to be in two of the happiest countries. That's the top 20. We see, however, that not all countries are happy. That indeed the countries that are outlined here in red are the least happy. So there's quite a bit of variance in happiness around the world. And I put up this slide to also tell you that this was generated by the UN and that there's a tremendous interest in the science of happiness, not just to make each and every one of us happier, but to influence government and policymakers to try to look not just at economic factors, but at other factors that might be very important that policy can in fact impact, one of them being human well-being. And I'm involved in one of those projects in a city in Southern California, trying to set a landmark metric in order to gauge whether policy, in fact, and which policies and how impact happiness. So you might say to me, oh, Southern California, who wouldn't be happy in Southern California, right? The movie stars, the great weather, and one thing I've heard many times since being here is discussion of the weather. Right. And you know, it's the same thing in Boston, Massachusetts. We say, if you don't like the weather, wait a minute. It is very changeable. So in winter, we complain about the cold and the wet, and particularly the wind. Boston is a windy city. And then spring comes very briefly and miraculously, and then it's summer. And then we complain about the heat and the humidity. And we all say we're not going to talk about the weather. So I'm here to tell you also the first fact about science of happiness that you may want to know. People living in California aren't any happier. And this was actually tested by looking at people who lived in the Midwest in the United States and people living in California. Beforehand, both predicted that people in California would be happier. After looking at their happiness ratings, they were pretty much identical. So why then do we have this illusion that Californians are happier and that weather makes a difference? Well, in part because we as humans tend to judge things by what we're thinking about right now. And if what we're thinking about right now is at the center of our happiness, then the judgment would be correct. But in fact, it's a focusing illusion. So if you think about California, you'll think about the weather, you'll assume people are happier, but many, many other factors go into day-to-day, whether you are happy and satisfied with your life. And it turns out that weather isn't a very good predictor. I put this slide also up to say that science has invaded this field. This was a field that was dominated by the poets, the philosophers, the religious leaders. In more recent time, the motivational speakers, the greeting card companies. And now you see a lot of what are called quants, the numbers people coming in to happiness. So what are we talking about? What is happiness? And I'd like to say that happiness is like one of those big overpacked suitcases we all take and we dread if airline officials want to look through them. We pack a lot into it. It's a big word. So I'd like to unpack it for you a bit. Whoops, what did I do here? I think I hit right below this, sorry.
That's okay. There we go.
Yes, excellent, thank you. So I'm going to turn back to the poets and philosophers who will always inform science as well. So you have the poetess Edna St. Vincent Millay, very famous for writing the poem First Fig in 1918, a youthful poem about ecstasy. My candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night, but ah, my foes and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. Everyone knows this poem? But Edna St. Vincent Millay was famous for having said, I have been ecstatic, but I have not been happy. What does that mean? Another example, this is Goethe, who said that he had never known even 4 weeks of happiness in his entire life. He was 75 at the time. But yet he was to say a few years later, and truly mean it, I am happy and would like to live my life over again. This was a man who said that life wasn't much of a pleasant business, and said that he embodied thoughtful levity and warm frigidity. How we like to think about this in the science of happiness is that there are two different meanings of happiness that we can work with and that we measure, and that people mean by this. In this suitcase, let's put it into two broad categories. One is hedonic happiness, subjective well-being. This is how you feel day to day. Your ups, your downs. Are you feeling cheerful? Are you feeling calm? Are you feeling excited? Are you feeling a bit sad or grumpy? It also measures engagement. How vital and active are you feeling? Do you feel involved in activities or a bit distanced and a bit tired? The other kind of happiness is eudaimonic happiness. This is a word dating back to Aristotle, kind of a positive demon. And this has to do with a life well lived. Are you satisfied with your life? Does your life have a purpose and a meaning to you? And in modern day parlance, it's often considered, are you progressing toward your goals? Are there things that you want in life? Are you moving towards them? Are you satisfied? These are separate conceptually, and they give correlated ratings. So if we ask someone, are you satisfied, are you happy? The ratings are correlated, but they are distinct. For health, I'm going to talk today about health and happiness. Both are important and both have been measured. A sense of meaning and purpose, particularly as people get older, and a sense of happiness and your emotions day to day. The one caveat I have is, surprisingly, that great variations in the intensity of happiness can often lead to unhappiness. So perhaps Edna St. Vincent Millay, all that ecstasy perhaps led to a bit of disappointment and disillusionment in the end. So one theme we'll come back to is that we always assume if something is good, even more of it's better, even more of that is better. Sometimes some moderation is also good. Psychology came into the fore in happiness studies with the beginning of the positive psychology movement, and Martin Seligman, who said for most of history psychology had concerned itself with all that ails the human mind. The goal of practitioners was to bring patients back to normal. And of course, we know that happiness and unhappiness aren't just a single continuum. We know that positive and negative emotions are at least somewhat independent. They have somewhat separate circuitry in the brain. And we all know that being less miserable is not the same thing as being happy. So we need to ask, what are the conditions in which humans flourish? And flourish is a word I'm going to use. It was the title of Maureen Gaffney's book, and it's a lovely word because it signals, we say positive. Sometimes people say, well, is the rest of psychology truly negative? We study memory, cognition, language. So flourishing, the plant metaphor is lovely, to grow vigorously and luxuriantly, to be in one's bloom, to thrive, to be in harmony, and to be in harmony, one must grow in rich soil. I did it again. Oh, shoot. Just tell me how to do it. Just tell me how to do it, and then we won't have to do this.
If we just had escape here.
Oh, escape. Okay. All right. I've got to get my thumb higher. So how do we measure happiness? And I'd love to say that we had very high-tech gizmos that we knew we could pinpoint some area that would signal happiness in the brain, in the body, whatever. For the most part, research uses self-report. People might be disappointed by this, but what would it mean if people were happy and did not know it? Right? So why would we ask you, if you say you're not happy, I would believe you. So the questionnaires focus on life satisfaction or happiness. Now, I understand that some scientists here will say that hedonic introspection is imperfect. Of course it is. Sigmund Freud started his sessions of psychoanalysis by saying the following: I need to know a great deal about you, so please tell me what you know about yourself, assuming, of course, that there are many things you don't. So what happens sometimes in studies is people will use their current mood. They're feeling good, they'll say they're happier than when they're not feeling so good. They, as Freud suggested, may not want to tell, even if they do know. But still, it's a measure that seems to correlate with other indices, whether your friends think you're happy, your nonverbal expressions of happiness, and others. So go use it. Finally, of course, people tend to cheat a little bit on happiness surveys. And so I send all of my students to a page where you can take all of the happiness tests. And they all say, I knew if I answered this, my score would go to be too pessimistic, and I'm not a pessimist. So people, it's a value. It is a positive value. So as Auden said, to admit it to oneself, unhappiness, is so damaging to one's self-conceit, except to those for whom it is their sole luxury, that such admission is rare. So I want to go with Marcus Aurelius, who said, no man is happy who does not think himself so. And that'll be our definition coming in here. And we always have people who will not get on the happiness bandwagon, who don't want to be unhappy, who don't mind being unhappy, glad to be unhappy. And we have some wonderful, fantastic writers who we all love and who I certainly love. So Flaubert once said, to be stupid, selfish, and have good health are 3 requirements for happiness. Though if stupidity is lacking, all is lost. A bit contemptuous of our topic of the day. And J.D. Salinger said, I'm a kind of paranoid in reverse. I suspect people are plotting to make me happy. So any people who don't want to be happy, who prize their unhappiness, who revel in their misery, that is fine. But they will not be the subject of discussion today. Since we have a measure of happiness, we also have come up with a happiness formula. This is the point in the talk when I'm going to do a little bit of this hand waving, which is that these categories and these percentages are not precise. But the general idea is that happiness is composed additively of 3 elements. One is the happiness set point, that we seem to come into life with a thermostat. And some people are, as William James said a century ago, born with 2 champagne bottles in their pocket. And others who are born living near the pain threshold. Any irritant will push them over. So we know this, and the people near the pain threshold we think of as neurotic. People born with a champagne in their pocket we tend to think of as extroverted, vivacious, gregarious, assertive, and positive. So babies come into the world with temperaments, but there's also a part here for the conditions of life, some of which you have no control over, like your race, age, sex. Some of which you have partial control over, whether you have wealth, marriage, the habitat. So those are the conditions of life. And finally, there's a category that we're trying to fill in called voluntary activity. And so far, we've come up with things that do increase happiness, such as quality of relationships, mindfulness, gratitude, exercise, sleep, volunteering. We'll get to those later in the talk. So here's the personality differences, and this is a cartoon I absolutely love by Charles Adam. The new baby's just born. I hope this guy knows what he's doing. So some of us are born a bit fretful, you know? We're kind of near that pain threshold, or we're very alert to harm. I call us harm avoidant. There are some who have kind of an intellectual distance on things. You know, shooting star, let's critique it. These are the two kinds of neurotics one can see in a Woody Allen movie. The second part after a set point is circumstance. You'll see it's a surprisingly low percentage here. And this is really interesting and one of the first findings in the science of happiness. People don't seem to be that affected by circumstance. And one of the reasons is not only the genetic set point, but that people adapt, even to very big and important events. So as cartoon, just married, 2 years later, that it's not that marriage doesn't make you temporarily happier, but most likely, in a few years, you're going to be back to yourself. So look at the chart on the left, and we see marriage. What happens is that people start to get happy before marriage, right? They're excited, they've fallen in love, they found the person, they're making their arrangements. And then, you know, for a year or so, even 3 or 4 for some people, they're still a bit happier. 7 years out, I guess it's that 7-year itch, they're back to themselves. Similarly, for many things that make people less happy, widowhood, people take an enormous plunge in happiness. And actually the first year after being widowed, higher rates of mortality. It's a very stressful event. It's a loss of an extremely important relationship. But even here, they don't get quite back to baseline, but within a few years, they're feeling considerably better and close to. Same for divorce, not quite as traumatic as widowhood. And in fact, the low point is right before the divorce happens. So when the marriage is starting to fall apart, there's a slight upswing as they get divorced. I don't want to say that nothing matters, because certain things really do. Unemployment matters, as some people will have experienced. It's very hard to get back to baseline after unemployment. It's not just the financial burdens, it's also a bit of loss of identity. Disability as well can lower the set point. So getting back to marriage, I want to say that, okay, people aren't as excited 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road, but wait. If you wait out in your marriage, people get much happier after the children have moved out of the house. So those little bundles of joy that we all anticipate as one of the prize moments of life, in fact, and my students hate this slide. They're like, what do you mean? My parents are going to be happier now? But in fact, happiness goes up. Less to argue about, less stress, the couple is back together alone and can go on with their lives. So know that if you wait it out, you will get happier again. Now here's another tip for a happy marriage. John Gottman, who runs something called the Love Lab in Seattle, very famous researcher, brings couples in, has them argue and discuss things while in a kind of living room setting. They're being videotaped. He looks at their verbal and their nonverbal behavior. And he says that one way to predict which of these marriages will last is simply looking at the number of positive and negative interactions. So if someone is frowning, arguing, not just arguing, but looking quite angry, and there's no positive interactions, this will be a tremendous problem and a very negative indicator. But note that he is saying you have to do 5 positive things to outweigh that 1 negative. Now, why do we need so much sugar with our bitter pill? Okay, and this is a divorce. No, this too bad. This slide didn't come out correctly. He said that the killer for a marriage, by the way, so beware of this expression, is contempt. That the best predictor he had of who would get divorced is if one of the married people looked at the others with contempt, a kind of moral superiority. This was kind of a death knell. Okay. So his 5-to-1 ratio said, chart the amount of time couples spent arguing versus interacting positively. Even if they're fighting, were they touching? Did they smile? Did they pay a compliment? Did they laugh? And if they did, the relationship was likely to be stable. So fighting couples do not despair. As long as there's also the positive, the marriage has a good chance. But do remember to add in the positive. Okay. So why do we have happiness? What is happiness about? Is it some kind of divine gift that we were given? Well, we know that brain circuits for happiness motivate us to accomplish things that enhance our biological fitness. Pleasure is one indicator, sex is fun, food tastes sweet. You know, the architect of humanity did not leave it to our whims whether we would eat, survive, procreate. It's built into our wiring that these are very motivational and very pleasurable. We also use social comparison. There's no one standard of well-being, so we tend to compare ourselves. If we feel we're not doing as well as other people, we feel badly. If we feel we're doing better, unfortunately, sometimes we're very pleased with ourselves. So we're anchored in a set of constraints and possibilities. As part of the biological role and purpose of happiness, positive emotions are about seeking opportunities in the world. Negative emotions are about avoiding harm. And studies have found that when you're in a positive mood, your mind becomes more creative, more open. You are more open to discovery. You're more likely to make more social connections. And they call this the broaden and build theory. Your world will broaden, you'll be able to build your resources at this time. So, you know, you go to a party or an event or on vacation, and people are very excited and they're happy together. And then they'll start saying, I want to call you, what's your number? Let's keep in touch, let's do this, let's start this project. That's the happy broaden and build. You get home, sometimes you never hear from these people, but part of the happiness is the creativity and is that broadening and building. What makes us happiest? And if there's one thing you can say that guarantees happiness more than anything else, it's good, positive social relationships. There's a huge difference between having 0 or 1 versus 0 to 2 or 3. Once you have 5 to 7 is never going to make as much difference to you in terms of relationships. But not having close relationships is a source of loneliness and unhappiness. Having good, strong social ties is very important. So when you ask people at a granular level, you know, when are you happiest? You look at them moment by moment. People beep in on these little handheld devices. Are you happy now? Who are you with? What are you doing? Do you want to continue? We see, not surprisingly, I don't think science is adding a whole lot here, that people are happiest when they're having intimate relations. When they're socializing, when they're having dinner, when they're relaxing. And they're much less happy, unfortunately childcare is rather low here, when they're commuting, when they're working. So we see that social relations are keys to happiness. And who inspires the most? Friends, relatives, spouses. The boss is below being alone. So it's not just any relationship, not just any. The boss is worse than being alone. It's a little stressful, perhaps. So for you bosses, all of us could be bosses. We have to keep this in mind. How do we make this a little more of a happy place? We know also biologically that happiness is contagious. I say it moves in a circular motion. I wanted that video up first, the happy song, because happiness moves from person to person. And one of the most famous public health surveys, the Framingham Heart Study, showed how much happiness spreads in clusters, as does loneliness and unhappiness. But happiness actually has a stronger push and degree of spread. So according to them, each additional happy friend you have boosts your good cheer by 9%, while each additional unhappy friend drags you down only 7%. And what they also found, which is really interesting, is that happiness, I can't escape. Someone else will have to put their thumb here, because mine just wants to go here. That happiness spreads to 3 degrees of freedom. So when you are happier, your friend is happier, your friend's friend is happier, and your friend's friend's friends. People you will never meet. So I always say to people, if you can't be happy for yourself, do it for others. So it was a really alarming, a very interesting study, and very interesting results that people would never have predicted. And if you have a friend who's close by, that will influence you much more than a friend who is distant. So again, the contagion aspect. Now, one reason why John Gottman said we need that 5-to-1 ratio is because, unfortunately, we are very sensitive to the negative. So we have basically a positive outlook, but then because of survival needs and our biology, we are very attuned to any harm or danger out in the world. Look at even basic physiological responses. We are extremely sensitive to the taste of bitterness, much less sensitive to salt and to sweet taste, because traditionally bitterness signals poisons. So, basically, if you miss an opportunity, if you're not happy, you'll have regret about it, but you could die if, especially in the worlds in which we evolved, you ignored a serious threat. We don't have to go into this, but even in healthcare physicians, one thing to know, those of you in the health career, that who gets sued, who gets malpractice suits against them, just a few seconds of clips of surgeons' tones of voice predicted it. Surgeons who sounded caring were much less likely than those who sounded dominant, whose voices were loud, fast, and domineering. Those people were significantly more likely to get sued. Again, that break of the positive relationship. So for all of us who do healthcare, it's very important to back up our messages. The other problem with negative emotions is we know they can linger. Something is nice, you feel good if it's a mild positive, it's brief, it goes away, maybe it lasts for a few hours. But sometimes we ruminate on the negative. We can't let it go, we chew it, and so this is another problem, especially in our modern world, that we tend to stay with the negative too long. So biologically, response to high arousal has always been called the 4 Fs, right? Fight, flight, freezing, and the mating response. But in today's world, we have a lot of emotions about things that aren't about our very survival. They might be about, something that's coming up tomorrow. They may be about something that someone else is worried about. They may be the things that might happen and might never happen in the future. They may be about things that happened a long time ago. We sit with them. We have the ability to project into the future, to remember the past. And they are situations that we do not want to flee and run away from. They're not situations where we want to fight with another. But yet our body revs up into this physiological state and holds on to it, which is very negative for our health. So let us move on to positive emotions in health. And indeed, the focus had always been on stress, anger in the heart, and other negative emotions. What we're finding now is that positive emotions are equally strong impact on health, and perhaps even more. So people who have positive emotions live longer, and there's multiple evidence for this. They live better and they live healthier lives. They show greater resistance to common infections, decreased loss of function and mobility in older adults, and they also have more and closer social ties, which independently is associated with better health. So since we're running a little late, I'll go over some of the humor a little later, but clearly we die from different things than our ancestors did. So here's caveman, something's just not right, the air's clean, water is pure, we get plenty of exercise, and no one lives past 30. So what killed our ancestors is very different from what kills us today for the most part in most countries. And one of our problems is that we are faced with many choices, and we are faced with an abundance of resources that would have boggled the minds of our ancestors. So we assume that something good, as I said, is going to be better and better the more and more of it we have. But that's not true in a culture of abundance. So here's a quick example. This was a study that was done on eating chocolate. How many people here like chocolate? Yes, I do too. So, you can't stop. So they gave people little bits of chocolate, 1 piece, 2 piece, 3 piece, up to 7 pieces. People keep eating it. And they had to rate at each point anything from neutral to I really want another piece, and all the way to eating more would make me sick, okay? And what you find is that people, goes down. Here you have more isn't better. So you see these are how motivated they are to continue and how pleasant the taste is. But yet how many people stop while it is still pleasurable? And if you look at the brain, you can see, I won't go into the slide in too great a detail, but you can actually see the brain shifting from a state of reward to a state of aversion. It's not the chocolate itself, it is the fact that we have overindulged. So the same substance can be both intensely pleasurable and not so, and clearly the example that comes most to mind are the addictions. How did we get interested in positive emotions and health? The most famous study was the study of the nuns. Anyone heard of this study? Yes, some of you have. So this was a study done on nuns in the US, and this was done as a public health study, nothing to do with positive emotions. They felt this was a very good controlled population because epidemiologists were interested then in many factors such as lifestyle, what you ate, and how you lived. Nuns have a controlled environment. They pretty much eat the same food, do the same things, and so they wanted to study them. What they found, at one point, someone looked back at their written biographies done when they were very young and came into the life there. They had to say why they were coming, give a little description of their life thus far, and they were scored for emotional content. They looked at this emotional content and survival rates. And what they found is that those who were the happiest lived far longer. And matter of fact, I brought that statistic. Yes, I did. Which was, if you looked at age, which nuns were still alive at age 85, 90% of the most cheerful were still alive versus 34% of the least. At 95, age 95, 54% of the most cheerful nuns were still alive. So this suggests again that there might be some protective factor about cheerfulness, some way that you are not stressing your body. And here was the superstar of the healthy aging study. She ended up in National Geographic. Sister Mattia, I think you pronounce it, lived to 104. And she was always smiling, but she wasn't happy with this picture. She was photographed for National Geographic. And she said, she didn't like it because it makes me look old. But she was considered happy, productive, and vivacious and set the gold standard for what is possible in old age. This is not the only study that found similar results. Someone looked through all of the 230 major league players in the 1952 season. They went through all the team pictures. They looked at who was smiling, who was partially smiling, who was not, and again found a very similar plot. The smilers were living longer. And partial smilers had a tiny advantage. So what might be the mechanisms by which happiness has a salutary effect on health? Okay. Positive emotions may be protective. They may be associated with reduced neuroendocrine, inflammatory, and cardiovascular activity. They are inversely related to cortisol production. These are all independent of age, gender, body mass, smoking, independent of any of these possible confounds. And there appear to be two pathways by which this happens. One is the influence on the autonomic nervous system and the stress hormones, and the other is influence on health-related behaviors. People who are happier tend to take better care of themselves. They tend to go more for their appointments. They tend to not be as pessimistic and worried about their symptoms. And surprisingly, people who are very worried about their symptoms often avoid exams. So how do we know that and one thing that has been found is that they're more resistant to colds and viruses. So how do we know this? This is a study on sociability, but positive affect was also tested. People were exposed to viruses. People were paid to do this. They got exposed to viruses, and they measured who developed the colds and how severe they were. And what they found, and you want to know how severe they were, well, they actually measured the mucus. So, I mean, they really went into the study very carefully. And what they found, again, is that people with the highest positive affect were the least likely to develop colds. They also said that they had the least number of subjective symptoms, and suggesting again that there's something protective about positive emotions. So the classic review paper was by Pressman and Cohen back in 2005, and what they said is a possible, not completely proved, connection with the endogenous opioids, but clearly on autonomic and the HB activity, clearly on social ties, and clearly on health practices. All of these may mediate to some extent the effects of stress. And as a last set of studies that I want to talk about, there are many studies in this area, but that's the broad overview, are studies on people who have the HIV virus. These, to me, were some of the most interesting studies that were done. And I call this, if the shoe doesn't fit, must we change the foot? People suffer a host of unwanted immune problems in their efforts to keep other people relaxed, Robert Trivers said. He was talking about deception and self-deception. And study after study has shown the benefits of disclosure, even if it's just in a journal, that you have to communicate things that are bothering you and you must not keep them hidden in. So people who had HIV infections, they progressed more rapidly in gay men who concealed their gay identity. They advanced more rapidly to the degree that participants concealed their gay identity. This was not attributable to depression, anxiety, level of support. It was a health effects of a psychological inhibition. And indeed, pride in who you are can save your life. Those who are very sensitive to rejection and social threat, again, more likely to evidence poorer HIV immunological and health responses, faster time to die of AIDS, died on average 2 years before. And these were carefully selected and healthy when the study started. So I'm going to start to talk to you now about, we see the effects of happiness, how can we all get happier? When I teach these courses at Harvard, people always are very interested in the genetics and the brain, but everyone gets, when am I going to start to learn how to be happier? And so one of the factors that is important in happiness that people don't talk about nearly as much is our love of nature. And going back to E.O. Wilson's idea that we have innate attractions and aversions to certain aspects of nature. We focus on life and lifelike processes. Our responses go from attraction to aversion, from awe to indifference, from peacefulness to anxiety. In the 1980s, someone did an accidental experiment. Had people who underwent gallbladder surgery. Some people were placed in rooms opposite a brick wall. You can see from the charts here, it was just completely random. And some people looked out on trees and nature. What they found was that people who looked out on nature recovered more quickly, requested less pain medication, and made less requests of the nurses and negative comments in general. It was published in Science, a very top-notch journal. And it wasn't a fluke. A more recent study looked at flowers and plants in the room. And again, 90 patients recovering from an appendectomy were randomly assigned to rooms, and their foliage and flowering plants were placed in them. Again, those with foliage and flowering plants had less intake of analgesics, lower systolic blood pressure and heart rate, lower ratings of pain, anxiety, and fatigue. Findings of this research suggest that plants in a hospital environment can be non-invasive, inexpensive, and effective complementary medicine. Why? I mean, you think that we have evolved in a theater of survival, that we respond to nature in a way that is often calming, that when we face brick walls and cold hospitals, it's actually anxiety-producing. And I studied this in people who were not in hospital. I did a small study on the power of flowers. We know that pollen has been found in the graves, even in Neanderthal graves. We know that ancient potentates always cultivated their gardens in all civilizations. We know that gardening is a very happy-making enterprise for many people. We know that people give flowers as signs of romantic interest, as signs of celebration, and also as solace, funerals. And so the thing to be that we see flowers, which of course presage food and fruit, are something that make human beings have very powerful responses. So I did a very simple study. I just gave bouquets of flowers. I worked with a local florist. We gave flowers to people during a survey. Didn't say this is what we were doing. We said, we're going to just track your moods for a few weeks. And halfway through, we just said, thank you. It's so nice of you. We just want to give you a little gift. The gift was either flowers or a hurricane lamp. So similar size, both in the home. For the group who got flowers only, in the following weeks, they reported less worry, less anxiety, and these are significant. It was only a 35-person sample, less depressed, and increasingly compassionate. So something very simple is that the sight of flowers seems to make us feel a bit happier. Other people have taken up on this and did a study where, in fact, people were more pro-social in the presence of flowers. They did an economic task looking at the division of money. And they thought that having an eye on the computer would make people more generous because it was like someone was looking at them, even though it was a computer screen. That didn't work. But they put up as a control measure a flower, and that made people more generous. The root seems to be through positive emotion. Something that induces positive emotion makes people more pro-social. So as Thoreau said, we need the tonic of wildness, exposure to nature, and again, don't have enough time to go into these in detail. Two different theories of why exposure to nature enhances health. One is stress reduction, as I said before, through physiological responses. The other is attention restoration. So exposure to urban versus natural environments show a difference in how you attend to space. In an urban environment, you have effortful attention. People walking by, sounds. You're paying attention in many ways. At work, you have effortful attention. Get on the key, someone else is calling. In nature, you have what has been called effortless attention. The breeze, the clouds, birds singing, that you are there, you're paying attention, but it's an effortless process. And so interesting studies of children with ADD find that their symptoms are much better after they've had a break and been out in nature. People are better at proofreading after they take a walk in nature versus in the city. So there is something about nature that can restore our attention as well. So any of you who want to take a break at work, I suggest going to one of the amazing, beautiful parks you have here in Dublin, which I've gone to in the 2 days I've been so far and have loved. In positive psychology, there's less attention to this aspect of happiness. It's called the appreciation of beauty and excellence. It's considered one of the virtues, and it's been understudied. So I wanted to give a bit of a plug to it today. It's also brain imaging of moral beauty. I promised you some tips and tools on happiness, and here they are. We're going to start with these 7. Savor the moment. We all look forward to things, right? But yet, most people, once they get there, they're doing something else. They're thinking about yesterday, they're thinking about what's next. If you can, stay with the moment and enjoy it. We're often in anticipation or backward memory. I would say to take control of your time. A lot of us get sucked in to doing things that are really not enjoyable or productive, and we all know what they are, and yet can't seem to control that. I would think about how do you want to best spend your time, when are you happiest, when are you most productive, and try to increase those times when you can. So much time is spent just on the computer, looking around, and after a while, it's just doesn't do very much for your happiness or productivity. Act happy, we'll get to this in a moment. Exercise makes you happier. It's a very good mood elevator. A simple mood elevator is take a walk or a run. Make time for sleep. Sleep is very important to mood. Give time and attention to close relationships, and be mindful. I'll go over that one too. Okay, act happy. So psychologists have actually done experiments where, in this experiment, this woman put chopsticks in her mouth to either hold the chopsticks so that there was a neutral expression, there was a happy expression, and there was even a Duchenne crinkly-eyed happiness. And what did she find? She found that people actually not only were happier, but they showed a physiological change just by smiling with the chopstick. They recovered faster from plunging their hand in cold water or doing a complex cognitive task. So simply smiling can start to initiate the entire autonomic process that comes with emotions. Mindfulness, probably most people here are familiar with mindfulness. Anyone not familiar with mindfulness? Then I don't need to go over this slide. 7 more suggestions. Express gratitude. Gratitude is a wonderful antidote for what often plagues modern life, envy and entitlement. Poor me. Someone else has more. Why haven't you given to me? What about me? And when we think about who has helped us, all the things that we have, all the gifts we've been given, all the support, all the many things that people do for us, it helps us to shift focus a lot. Some people find it helpful to give a gratitude card to someone. And this is one of those things where people break out in tears. But truly, if there's someone in your life that you are very grateful for and have never really said it, if you write them a gratitude letter, and especially if you deliver it and say it to them, there won't be a dry eye in the house. But it truly is very, very powerful. Gratitude is very powerful. Make your pleasures varied and savor them. We heard about adaptation. People get used to things. That TV, it was nice, it was big. A month later, is it still big? Is it, but there's a new one out. So we want to always vary your pleasures and to savor them while you have them. Know your strengths. We'll get to that one in a moment. Make your income a tool for happiness. And self-pride and benefits of disclosure we talked about earlier. So people say, there's a huge debate in the happiness literature about the role of money in happiness. Many people will say, beyond a certain point, there's very little added increment to happiness. Biblically, you hear the phrase, money is the root of all evil. That's actually not the phrase. It's the love of money is the root of all evil. Because in fact, there are ways to use income to make yourself and others happier. People who donate time, who volunteer, who give their money to others in need actually are happier than people who do not. People who are more generous, because the happiness comes back to you in people's gratitude. If you spend your money on experiences more than objects, that often is a source of greater happiness. So for example, at some companies now, they're giving trips and experiences to people instead of bonuses. Because in fact, those experiences stay with us in memory and are sources of great happiness. So in terms of knowing what your strengths are, there's a strengths test on the web. Anyone wants to take it. This website has every possible test you could ever want to do to understand your own happiness. And one of them is the VIA. And that is a test that looks at the kinds of strengths and virtues we all have, and we can get a profile of what we consider our strongest virtues and our strengths, as well as our weaknesses. So I won't identify the college here, but in a college I know well, students were given this test, and they came out highest on independent critical thinking, capacity to love, social intelligence, curiosity. They came out rather low on modesty and humility. Very low on spirituality, sadly low on love of learning. So us educators have to not only say that we want, that people have to love learning because it is a fantastic process. And caution, prudence, and discretion. That also. Why be cautious when you're in college and life is in front of you? Also know your weaknesses or things that just aren't part of your happiness formula. So this is the famous environment everyone's so hyped up about. I'm talking about nature. If you don't like going out in nature, don't do it. If gratitude makes you feel guilty, as it does for some depressed people, don't do the gratitude letter. Whatever it is, think about what you enjoy, what's personal to you, and what bits of information you can incorporate into your own life. Here's gratitude too. Why not be happy about all the diseases you don't have? Right? Talking about health? And by the way, I just want to give a shout out to the Cartoon Bank and Robert Mankoff, who supplied a lot of these cartoons very generously to me as I was working on this. So anyone who wants to see some of these cartoons, buy them, whatever, the Cartoon Bank is full of them, and they're really wonderful. And finally, at our end, I want to talk about the Hollywood formula and the science of peaks and ends. So in Hollywood, films always get wrapped up at the end, right? There's usually a happy ending. What we find in happiness research is duration doesn't matter that much. What matters to our memory is the peak, high or low, and the end of an experience. We have 20,000 moments a day, little 3-second. What do we retain from these? We retain snapshots. We can't possibly look back over all of our endeavors and remember all of those moments. But we tend to remember them this way. So if you went on a vacation, if you went to a restaurant, if you went out with one person or another, if you come to a lecture, you'll tend to remember something, some peak, some piece of information, some interaction, some epiphany, beautiful music that you heard. That's a peak. There can also be a negative peak. And the end. And these will stay with you disproportionately. And in terms of how you remember the episode, and also in what decisions you make, whether to do it again. So this was discovered by Daniel Kahneman, and it takes a certain genius, which he definitely has, to wring knowledge about happiness from a colonoscopy. And this is what he did. He studied people who were undergoing colonoscopies and wanted to see that if you made the ending more gentle, would people come back? And these were studied before all of the anesthetics we have now, so they were indeed very uncomfortable. So you see patient A actually had, if you look just at total amount of pain, more pain than patient B, who ended earlier, but ended on an abrupt out. Patient B was much more likely to say that the whole event was okay, not that painful, and to come back for their next appointment. Peaks and ends are how we remember it. And so we've also done studies on plunging your hand in cold water, done it for happy experiences as well. Peaks and ends are important. And why are they so important to us and to remember is because, sure, we want to maximize the sheer amount of happiness, the moment-to-moment happiness in our own lives, but we also want to maximize our memories of happiness. Memories are what we get to keep. So all the old wisdom about don't go to sleep angry, don't walk away in the middle of an argument, make peace, leave someone nicely, have a good ending, the Hollywood ending, is in part a great deal of wisdom in that. So on that note, I end this talk and express my gratitude for being here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was absolutely